The courtroom was alive with the usual hum of anticipation, lawyers rustling papers, spectators whispering in hushed tones, and the distant sound of a gavel striking in another chamber. Judge Marion Taylor sat at the bench, her gaze steady and professional. It was another day, another case. At least, that's what she thought. The bailiff called the case, the state of Louisiana versus Nathaniel Brooks. Marion shifted slightly in her seat, her hands resting on the polished oak of the bench. She glanced at the file in front of her. Assault, robbery, resisting arrest. A familiar ache of disappointment settled in her chest. Another lost soul tangled in the system, she thought. When the defendant was brought in, her world tilted. The man standing before her, shackled at the wrists and ankles, was not a stranger. He was Nathaniel Brooks. Her Nathaniel. Her throat tightened as a flood of memories surged forward. The summer afternoons they spent racing bicycles down the dusty streets of Bellevue, Louisiana. The late-night talks under the magnolia tree in her backyard. The promises they made as kids to always have each other's backs, no matter what. But the man standing before her wasn't the boy she remembered. His shoulders were hunched, his face lined with years of hardship. Yet his eyes, those deep, soulful eyes, were unmistakable. Marion's grip on the gavel faltered. For the first time in her career, she hesitated. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in as she tried to process the impossible. Nathaniel looked up, his expression a mixture of shock and resignation. Recognition flickered in his eyes, but he quickly looked away, his head bowing slightly. The courtroom waited. Marion forced herself to speak. "Mr. Brooks, you stand accused of assault and robbery. How do you plead?" Nathaniel's voice was rough, almost unrecognizable. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Her heart pounded. She wanted to stop everything, to demand answers. What had happened to him? How had their paths diverged so drastically? But her role as a judge demanded composure. "Proceed," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. As the prosecutor began their opening statements, Marion's mind raced. This wasn't just any case. This was Nathaniel. And somehow, she had to figure out how to separate her past from her present before it was too late. The courtroom blurred as Marion's mind drifted to a time long before her black robes and the gavel in her hand. She and Nathaniel had grown up on opposite sides of Bellevue, Louisiana, divided not by distance, but by the unspoken rules of their segregated town. Her family's house was a modest one-story with a white picket fence, while Nathaniel's family lived in a weathered home at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by fields. Their friendship had been an anomaly. She remembered how they met. An accidental encounter at the edge of a creek where she had wandered too far from her own backyard. Nathaniel had been fishing, his line tangled in the reeds. She'd offered to help, and that simple gesture had turned into years of secret adventures and shared dreams. "Marion," he had once said, lying on the grass beside her under the stars, "you ever think about leaving this place? Like really getting out? Going somewhere people don't look at us funny just for sitting together?" She had laughed then, brushing off the idea. But Nathaniel wasn't joking. Even as a child, he saw the world for what it was, a place that didn't always make room for people like him. Their bond deepened despite the whispers, the sideways glances, and the outright disapproval from both sides. But the pressure was always there, like a weight neither of them could shake. And then, one day, it all ended. It was the summer before high school when Marion's father caught them sitting on the porch together. His voice had been cold, sharp with authority. "Marion, get inside. Now." She'd hesitated, glancing at Nathaniel, who stood frozen in place. "Go on," he had said quietly, his voice tinged with resignation. "I'll see you around." But they hadn't seen each other again. Not really. Her father forbade her from going near Nathaniel. And soon after, Nathaniel's family moved away. Marion threw herself into school, her ambitions carrying her far beyond the town of Bellevue. She went to law school, chasing dreams of justice and fairness. But she never forgot the boy who had taught her what courage looked like. Now, sitting on the bench, she wondered what had become of Nathaniel after she'd walked into that house and closed the door on their friendship. His record showed a series of arrests for minor offenses, petty theft, Loitering. Nothing that screamed of violent nature. But then again, how much of someone's life could you see in a few lines on a rap sheet? The prosecutor's voice snapped her back to the present. He was describing the alleged crime. Nathaniel was accused of assaulting a store clerk during a robbery at a convenience store in Baton Rouge. The clerk had suffered minor injuries, and the cash register had been emptied. Nathaniel was picked up a few blocks away, the cash allegedly still in his possession. Marion studied Nathaniel as the prosecutor spoke. His posture was slouched, his hands clasped in front of him, but his expression was unreadable. Did he really do it? Or was there more to the story than what the prosecution claimed? The courtroom adjourned for a lunch break, giving Marion a moment to gather her thoughts. As she returned to her chambers, her assistant, Evelyn, approached with a hesitant expression. "Judge Taylor, are you okay? You seemed a little distracted," Evelyn asked. Marion hesitated. Should she confide in Evelyn? Would it be unprofessional to admit that she knew the defendant? Instead, she shook her head. "I'm fine. Just a lot on my mind." But she wasn't fine. How could she be when the past she'd buried so deeply was sitting just a few feet away, waiting for her judgment? The courtroom was packed when the trial resumed. Reporters scribbled notes. The clerk shuffled papers. And the prosecutor, a sharp-faced man named Richard Green, was ready to deliver his case. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Green began, his voice firm. "This case is about violence. It's about a man who walked into a convenience store and, without provocation, attacked an innocent clerk before stealing the cash register contents. The evidence will show that Nathaniel Brooks is guilty of this crime." Marion felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The prosecutor's tone was clinical, detached, as if Nathaniel were nothing more than a name on a docket. She glanced at Nathaniel, whose gaze remained fixed on the table before him. The defense attorney, Rachel Torres, rose to present her opening statement. She was young but confident, with a voice that carried across the room. "The prosecution would have you believe this case is straightforward, but it's not. My client, Nathaniel Brooks, has maintained his innocence from the start. We will show that there is more to this story and that assumptions made on the night of the arrest do not hold up under scrutiny." The trial unfolded with a mix of predictable and unexpected moments. Witnesses were called, evidence presented, and cross-examinations conducted. A grainy surveillance video became a focal point of contention. The prosecution argued that the figure in the video was Nathaniel, while the defense pointed out the footage's poor quality and inconsistencies in the timeline. Nathaniel's testimony, raw and heartfelt, became the emotional crux of the trial. "I've made mistakes in my life," he admitted to the jury, "but I didn't do this. I was walking home when the cops stopped me. They didn't ask questions. They just decided I fit the bill." Marion's throat tightened as she listened. His words were a plea not just for justice but for humanity. When the jury returned with their verdict, the tension in the room was palpable. In the case of the state of Louisiana versus Nathaniel Brooks, we find the defendant not guilty. A wave of emotion swept through the courtroom. Marion's gavel restored order, but her heart ached with a mixture of relief and sorrow. As the room cleared, Nathaniel approached her. "You knew me," he said quietly. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I couldn't," she replied, her voice trembling. "I had to be fair." Nathaniel studied her, his expression a blend of hurt and understanding. "Fair," he repeated. "That's the thing, Marion. The world's never been fair. Not for people like me." "You're right," she said softly. "And I'm sorry." He gave a faint nod before walking away, his back straight as he disappeared through the courthouse doors. Marion sat alone in the empty courtroom, the weight of his words pressing on her. She had upheld the law, but justice, true justice, felt elusive. As she left the courthouse that evening, the fading sun casting long shadows across the steps, she made a silent vow. She couldn't change the past, but she would fight to ensure the future held more than hollow promises of fairness. It would be hard, perhaps even impossible, but she owed it to Nathaniel and to herself to try.